He likes to do that. So it's not as clear that he's given the signal. Then we can argue about it later. So did you give me the signal? I do remember that. Does YouTube remember that? All right. So this is called Aseity, but obviously we have not finished even the implication section here. However, the implications that we're going to get into was just further elaborating, in Dalazal's words, what we already looked at from Scripture about establishing those three attributes. Remember, infinity, independence, and the fact that God's creator. So he's a different way to look at it. We'll skip that then. There was another section that I was going to take from Aquinas' section. I'm going to skip that too. But let me summarize the implication section with the words of Ed Feser. He summarizes that bridge from natural theology to theology proper by saying this. He says, quote, as arguments for a first cause, in other words, natural theology arguments, like Aquinas' argument for the first cause. As arguments for a first cause are ipso facto arguments for an absolutely simple or non-composite being. In other words, by the nature of the case, an argument for a first cause is an argument for a simple and non-composite cause. Feser says, in short, classical theism and the doctrine of divine simplicity necessarily go together. To deny the one is implicitly to deny the other, end quote. I love statements like that. The whole doctrine and division thesis, which is easy to misunderstand. You could say what he said by saying, deny simplicity, and you've denied, how do you finish that? You've denied God. Technically, that's what he's saying. Let me unpack that so that people don't freak out. I'm not saying that if you've never heard of this, or if you're struggling now, that you're a closet atheist. I'm not saying that, and that's not what Feser's saying. What he is saying, and what I would insist on, is that just like a foundation to the house, you can't pour Kool-Aid in it. Like, you shouldn't pour Kool-Aid into the foundation of a house, because it'll make your house go in. It doesn't mean you're not a person. It doesn't mean you don't live anywhere, or that you don't pay your bills. It just means you probably shouldn't be the person to be pouring cement at the foundation. Okay? And so that has consequences. That's all he means. And since we're doing systematic theology here, we're doing some foundation building with the doctrine of God. And if you get this wrong, you'll get everything else wrong. I'm not a Christian. My mommy's not a Christian. That's not what I said. I said the builders will get it wrong. If the architects get it wrong, the builders will get it wrong. If the architect, the person that makes the rulers and other tools for the architect, if they, trying to think of different ways you could play practical jokes on architects or whatever. But anyway, you get the idea. Hopefully you get the idea, because this is one of the most badly misunderstood concepts. But we're doing systematic theology. The parts actually have to go in the right place. Otherwise, it's just going to be a big mess. So yes, you need divine simplicity, and you need it at the foundation. Let's take some objections. Objections from various kinds of people, philosophers, theistic philosophers, as well as Reformed theologians. So I'm not going to take objections from people that are just way outside the Christian faith or just secular philosophy professors, because I want to get people that are supposed to be on our team so we can really get our heads wrapped around this and think through it for our team. Okay, so in modern theology, a basic objection, I mentioned it at the beginning, is that if God is absolutely simple, a lot of all these other incommunicable attributes too, but this is one of them. If God is like that, then in this case, contingent truths in relation to God can't be true. And I said this is the first one we're going to look at. So I thought this was going to be the impersonal one. How much of this do I want to? I already did that, but I like the picture. Okay, and so one of the things that's true, but this is the wrong one. Okay. So one of the things that's true about God being simple is that all of his attributes are necessary. Right? But let's see, he created some guy down here. And so all of a sudden, he's creator, he's Lord, perhaps if he's sinned, he's Savior. And you can, anyway, he could be all these other things. You could just make a list of all the things that God is. Now we ascribe to God in relation, and that's really the key here. So let's do this. And I won't use the label that Bruce Ware uses yet, but what I will use is the opposite of this would be contingent. Can we say that? Okay, and so one particular theistic philosopher, Thomas Morris, basically says the doctrine of simplicity implies one of two things with relation to this. And you've got to choose your poison. And what he's going to say is that the doctrine is incoherent because of these two different directions. Okay, so Morris is making this objection. Since a contingent property, like creator, let's just take that, a contingent property is not a necessary property, but both have to be his properties. Okay? Then, not all of his properties are identical. So the first problem that leads to the others that I'm going to get to in a second is that not all of his properties are identical. We said that all that is in God is God. All his properties, by the way, this is one of the problems right away. I'll bring it in later, but even using a word like property, shape, color, texture, that's part of the problem here to begin with, but we'll come back to that. But if all that is in God is God, then what we're really saying is that these are identical, but the necessary and the contingent are not identical. So that's the first problem that leads to the choose your poison kind of thing that Morris is setting before us. For example, and these are my examples, God wills the cross, or that God knows Abraham. So that's Abraham. If we conjoin those to the premise that all of God's attributes are really identical with each other, so this red is not helping me out here, so let me grab this. Let's put up two premises. If my two premises are all God's attributes are identical, and if I say God is a friend of Abraham's, then what follows? And here comes the choose your own adventure. One of two things follows because they're not identical with each other, but one of them is either the cross or Abraham are necessary to God. So I solve the problem by saying, fine, then they're not contingent. Well, then God is a friend of Abraham is necessary to God's essence. And so they're really identical in that way. Okay, or we can go the other way. Part of God's will and knowledge, namely that he would be a friend of Abraham, presumably he knew that from before the foundations of the earth, are not necessary. And so either side of the dilemma would seem to Morris to undercut classical theism. Okay, there's all sorts of problems here. One is the whole property thing to begin with, which we'll save for Plantinga's objection. That's next. But there is a distinction between, and this is going to seem highfalutin for just a second, but it's actually an easy concept once you get the hang of it. There's a distinction between real properties and what are sometimes called Cambridge properties. And the only reason it's called that is because Bertrand Russell and some other guy, Taggart, came up with it, and they were at Cambridge when they came up with it. And so, for example, if I am a sibling and I get taller than you, say we're twins. And no, we're not twins. That's stupid. I just get taller than you, even though I'm younger than you. But there came a point where I got taller than you. You became shorter than me. But you became that in relation to me getting taller than you. Okay? And so the example Socrates became shorter than Plato, only because Plato grew taller. Okay? And so that's a Cambridge property, something in relation to something else. Same thing is called a Cambridge change. Socrates, in that case, or me, didn't necessarily become taller or shorter. The other person did. But in relation to them, my relationship to them in terms of height changed. Okay? So that's all that's meant by that. Now, here's why this comes home to roost here. The doctrine of divine simplicity does not deny that God has these sorts of relations. Now, we're going to call them properties for a second just to kind of humor the person the objection. We're not denying that God has, in simple English language, subject and predicate, he has made a promise to Abraham. He has fulfilled his promise to Abraham and so forth. And so, I think this is Phaser saying this. Similarly, divine simplicity properly understood, does not entail that all of God's properties are identical, but rather only that all of his real properties are identical. So do you remember the distinction between real and logical? Here, the distinction that they're calling real versus Cambridge properties are going to be ones that are relational down here. Now, part of this you're going to have to wait for. When we get to the beginning of Aseity, I'm going to make that distinction. We'll just make it between what's in God, in himself, versus what's happening here. And the classic example is, and Ware brings this up, so maybe I'll wait, God's wrath toward me changed by the cross. God's disposition changed. His wrath was turned. Okay, that's sort of the classic and hardest one to get behind. People, I think, would struggle with the doctrine of simplicity or immutability or eternality. People ask that, when did justification happen? And when? It's not meant to be a trick question. People are honestly asking, but it's actually wrongly asked. Okay, we're gonna answer more and more of that objection in answering the other ones because they're all closely related, as you could probably imagine. Alvin Plantinga, another theistic philosopher from today, mentioned him a time or two. He criticizes the doctrine on the ground that it makes God equal to each of his properties. So he's doing it too. He's saying properties for this, and that's part of the problem. And it renders God himself as one of those properties. And so I guess he has in his mind God. Oh my God, are you serious? God equals his essence, equals, just pick one, his justice, and so on. So you have God and his attributes and him as one of his properties. Okay? And so that's the way Plantinga hears it. Other Reformed theologian, Ronald Nash, followed that same reasoning as Plantinga did. Fazer basically exposes three false assumptions in Plantinga's thinking. Three problems in this whole idea. And maybe I won't list them up just because I'll do pictures only up there. It's time. One, Plantinga's use of property is one-dimensional. It covers all conceivable predicates. So, for example, if I'm a man, it's my subsistence, my substance, a man, the particular thing, I'm a rational animal. That's my essence. But of course, the sense in which I'm rational and the sense in which I'm animal are two different predicates. They cover different things. There's other animals and there's other rational beings, conceivably. And so that's one thing. As a rational animal, I am capable of understanding language. That's not the same as this, which is not the same as this. So if you say this is a property, or my name even, this is a property, this is a property, this is a property, and you can multiply that. My hair, cutting my hair, is it still brown? It is. Do I still have hair? Well, in one sense, I don't. In other words, what's happening here is Plantinga is just lumping everything under the word property that are actually multi-level distinctions. Fazer says you make a distinction between essence and properties and contingent accidents and intrinsic accidents and relations to other things. All of those are predicates, but you don't call them properties in the same sense. And so Plantinga, smart guy, is just using a word that nobody that holds to this doctrine would ever use it in that sense. Okay, so that's his first problem. Secondly, this is more obscure. The attributes are conceived as if they exist in Plato's third realm. In other words, here's that being that made everything. He's looking to the blueprint to create the world. That's all he means there. It's not very exciting, but that's kind of the way it's true. Third problem, he interprets predications of these attributes in God and in us in a univocal way, and that's going to be Frame's problem too. There's a whole lot of things to get into there, but I'm just going to say read that chapter 6 in Fazer where he answers Plantinga. Speaking of Frame seems to make a similar mistake on the basis that if all of our predicates of God were analogical, and they are, let me give you an example. I need more board. If I say, not just God is infinite and space is infinite. But also, what about this? God is and Andrew is. In other words, exists. Would you take this and this to be, remember we talked about univocal, they mean the exact same thing. Equivocal would be totally opposite extreme, ball versus ball. One means dance, one means bouncy thing. And you realize that, like, oh, totally different meaning. That's equivocal. Thomas's middle ground is analogical. Our speech is analogical, especially when you're talking about the difference between God and the creature. This doesn't mean the same exact thing. This does not mean the exact same thing. Frame looks at that and says, well, if you do that, you're going to have this infinite regress of analogies that no one ascription to God versus an same word with something else is going to mean the same thing. It's always going to be like something else, and it's going to be an infinite regress in analogies. And so Frame says, when we see in Scripture or when theologians say that God is infinite or God is all-powerful, we take that at face value. It means exactly what it means in other contexts. Okay? And so that's Frame's argument. Let's see. Oh, there's a section in Dolezal about, this was actually happening a little bit in Hodge and Dabney as well, and Bavinck criticized Hodge for it. I'd have to read that to see, but I did notice that, and I looked in Bavinck, and sure enough, there it was. So you did have a loss of Thomas's doctrine of analogy, at least a little bit in the Reformed view before Van Til. A lot of the rest of this comes from Van Til and that stuff, but in any event. Another motive for denying simplicity, another objection, comes from more conservative circles. Frames in conservative circles too, by the way, but this is the big one right here. Some have attempted to uphold God's sovereignty by supposing that he can freely choose to be and to do that which he otherwise would not. Or perhaps we should say in ways not bound by what we know about his nature. Think of Jonah 3:10. We just saw it. So God decided to do what he said he would, he did not do what he said he would do to the Ninevites because they repented. Oh, so he learned and found out that he was going to, and we saw, no, that doesn't work. But as a general rule, these theologians are pushing back and saying that's not because God's nature necessarily issues forth into all he does and all he is and all that we see, but for some other reason. That he freely chooses to do that which we know his attributes say he isn't. And it affects all sorts of attributes. And this is a doctrine that we call theological voluntarism. I say theological because, well, there's other forms of voluntarism. And just think about it, of the will. And so voluntarism pits God's will over against his nature. And this is not new. The nominalists in the Middle Ages, William of Ockham and others, argued this against Aquinas and other scholastics. And so it was really realism versus voluntarism. Does God's nature, he does all that he does according to his own nature, realism, or does he do whatever he wants apart from a nature? And there's reasons why people get sucked into it, but that's another class. That's what voluntarism does. And so naturally, people who are Calvinists but who don't study classical theology can go in for this because God's sovereignty, that's what we're all about, right? Yeah, but it's not God's sovereignty against his other attributes. So, Bruce Ware has especially gone this route. I totally missed this, but it's wrapped up in the meaning of his books, God's Greater Glory and God's Lesser Glory, where it divides between, and he forces himself to divide into two different kinds of relations in God, or attributes in God. And key assumption described by Dolezal. He says this, and one more term he uses, actually two more. Dolezal uses the terms theological mutualism to describe a group of theologians way before the New Calvinists came along. 19th century Dorner and others that Bavinck was dealing with. And you process theology, of course, open theism does this, but you have God here, world here, There's reciprocity. There's mutuality. That's what's describing that. At the extreme, process theology, God is in process. He is growing with the world. Open theism does that with God's knowledge with respect to our free will. So there's reciprocity between God and the creature, but especially that one little creature called human beings that have moral agency and free will. And then it gets this name. And who are they talking about? They're talking about the same people, but it's just highlighting. So another thing you can call this same thing is theistic personalism. Well, there is a distinction. Here you're saying, in order for God to be a person, what does it mean to live and move and have being? And that's, well, it means to change. What does it mean to make decisions? Well, it means to be in time or to learn new things and to do it on the basis of things that he learned. Well, that's what we do. Okay, so if you see those phrases that Dolezal and others are drawing attention to those, in a new Calvinism, the real reason they're doing it is because they really believe that they're upholding divine sovereignty. Anyway, Dolezal says, the key assumption is this, that in God there are some attributes that belong to his essence, while there are other attributes he acquires through relation with his creatures. So right back here, except now the distinction is not between necessary and contingent. Now the distinction would be ontological or essential versus relational. Well, we just said God has a relationship with Abraham. So that relationship is an attribute. Okay, so that's kind of the breakdown, the way of thinking in the mind of a theistic personalist. You see this, by the way, in non-reform circles and reform circles. William Lane Craig's understanding of God in time. We'll get to this when we get to eternality and time and knowledge. They'll both be relevant because Craig would say that no, God is eternal, i.e. he is atemporal before creation. Once he creates, then he's inside of time. Okay. Oliphant, his notion of covenantal properties, that God has properties owing to and it's the same setup, but now the emphasis is covenant theology. Okay, same setup in his book, God With Us, which he's, that whole thing going on right now. That whole thing. I will leave that alone. Where attempts a more deliberate breakdown of God's relational essence as opposed to his ontological essence and so forth. And in this way, God's personal dealings with the creature can be taken at face value. More preeminently, the cross, if the wrath of God is satisfied, then it seems to follow that his divine disposition toward ex-sinner has changed. Where it concludes that such are real relational changes in God. Real relations in God, either added or subtracted, but where it says they don't affect God's essential immutability. His essential ontological immutability, he is absolutely immutable. I know we're not on immutability right now, but it affects that right away. It immediately affects that. There are relational aspects in God that change. So the change happens in God. But you have to ask, is he using the word ontology and the word essence the way that people have always used those words? I would think no. These kind of objections raise larger dogmatic questions. Last point about simplicity. Larger dogmatic questions as we turn to the rest of our theology, even using words like properties, even the word attributes. Some theologians have said, well, why not use, for example, Louis Berkhoff. Berkhoff, and I always wondered, why did Berkhoff use the word perfections for God's attributes? Is it just sort of a stylistic difference? No, it's this question of God's simplicity. He considered the word virtues as well, but that had ethical connotations, so he didn't go with that. He went with perfections. He noticed in 1 Peter 2:9, you have a rough synonym when we declare the excellencies of him, the excellencies of God. And so Berkhoff could have gone with that, but that might have been confusing too. So he went with perfections. But why did he do that? Well, in Berkhoff's mind, the advantage of that alternative is that it avoids the suggestion that something is being added to the being of God. So I don't necessarily think you have to go that far, but anyway, that was Berkhoff's motive for using the word perfections, is that he was trying to protect the simplicity of God. So there you go there. Last point about simplicity. Not only is divine simplicity necessary to the integrity of this doctrine, theology proper, the doctrine of God, but given that order in theology that W.G.T. Shedd talked about, that absolute order, that you start with God and what you believe about God affects everything else, and that's the way it should be. If that's true, then this is necessary to the integrity of every other doctrine. We're going to see things about other doctrines. The church is one. Why is the church one? Because God is one. And it's not just a rah-rah thing. Oh, isn't that neat? We'll put that on our banner and our leaflets in our church. No, that's an actual ontological reflection of something that's in God. We'll see that in a bunch of other things. The work of redemption is one because God is one. We'll see that. The Catholic theologian F.J. Sheed went as far to say that, quote, every current heresy begins by being wrong on simplicity. That's a bold statement. Now, that might be true in a very indirect analysis. Maybe you can trace every heresy back to that in some way that maybe the person wasn't thinking about, and maybe that's what he means. But we can at least make a few more direct sketches of the same kind. Let's listen to Athanasius. When Athanasius was talking about the doctrine of God, he saw very early that simplicity was necessary to the eternal generation and fully divine nature of the Son. So here's what Athanasius said about that. He said, quote, the divine generation, meaning the Son, the begottenness of the Son from all eternity, not just starting in time. That's not something that happened merely in time. The divine generation must not be compared to the nature of men. Muslims do that. Why do they do that? Partly because we mess up the doctrine and we don't do a good job helping them not do that. Anyway, nor the Son considered to be part of God, nor the generation to imply any passion whatever. God is not a man, for men beget passively, having a transitive nature. But with God this cannot be, because he is not composed of parts. But being impassible and simple, he is impassibly and indivisibly Father of the Son. So neither the persons, this is me now, neither the persons nor the relations proper to each are parts of God's essence. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, their persons, and what is proper to their persons, their relations, are not parts of God. W.G.T. Shedd concurs, stating that, quote, the whole essence is in each person and in each attribute. Okay. Sorry. Aseity is shorter. Dalzell did a funny thing. He was being all serious and it was really hard, and these people were like, really having to focus and concentrate. It was really heady stuff, and he wanted to give them a memory device for Aseity, if you watch any of those videos. But anyway, he said, if you can't get this in your mind, just think of foghorn leghorn. The chicken, or the whatever he was, the rooster, and, I say, and he would always boss people around like that. And then he got serious again. So I was like, okay, I'll have to remember that. So if that helps, use foghorn leghorn. Same thing, definition, testimony, implications, objections, slight difference, a lot shorter. Introduced this distinction already in say versus ad extra. That's very, very important, especially here, because of what we're going to say about aseity, which, let's just erase everything. Never use dark green again. It does not erase very well. By the way, there's your words right there. Say, and this is tricky. Say means self, and it's not Greek non, it's from, but that's not good. We want to say of self, which is really going to mean of himself. Okay, so that's the idea. That's what the word means. I know it's Latin. Nobody uses words like that anymore. You could use synonyms for it. Think self-sufficiency, self-existence, independence. Those are all fine. You could use all of those for aseity. But it's very important to say of himself and not simply from himself, because that could give the idea, again, that God is his own cause. And we don't want to say that. We want to say God is his own reason. Remember, that was different, the principle of sufficient reason and the principle of causality, but we don't want to say God is his own cause, because then he's saying, we're right back to voluntarism. He chooses to activate himself, what was potential. No, he doesn't. Stop. So that's false. We want to say with the Westminster Confession, the quote, and this is Westminster Confession chapter 2, section 2, God hath all life, glory, goodness, blessedness in and of himself, and is alone in and unto himself all sufficient. So a big phrase talking about aseity. Not standing in need of any creatures which he hath made. So the whole reason for God is in God. We don't want to appeal to something deeper inside of God. Well, you got to really go into the depths of God for this one. You're compromising simplicity to begin with. But to suppose that this other is somehow outside of God, the whole thing is God. Remember Exodus 3:14, that passage. R.L. Dabney says that Exodus 3:14 means, the name means his self-existence and independence. So that same name of God that implies his simplicity is also very clearly implying his aseity. And we can classify biblical texts on the aseity of God by different ways in which God is not dependent. We're told that God is in need of nothing. Some of the same, we looked at these from Dolezal's book. He cited Acts 17:25 as if he needed anything. He doesn't need anything. Not indebted to anyone, Romans 11:35, so that verse. But can we be more specific than those verses that we already looked at? Well, look in the book of Job, in Job 35, verse 7, and Job 41:11. And there's tons of verses that are like this, but it's very personal in Job because he's in a fight for his life. He's saying that he's in the right. The question is, can he be in the right given all of his suffering? And the friends of Job, even though they're telling a big lie, say it with a lot of things that are true. So there's a lot of true theology in it. And so Job 35:7, if you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Notice the premise here. It's not simply God doesn't need anything from you. He already has it. That's in play too. But even if you're righteous, even if you're right, you don't contribute anything to God's moral being. Okay, so God's moral life is of himself. Okay, Job 41:11, he says, and now this is God speaking, who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So the same language as Romans 11. He's not indebted to anyone. He can't be contributed to by anything. Secondly, God has all life in himself. Here's another set of verses to use, but a classic one is John 5:26. Jesus says that really verbatim, that God has life in himself. I mean, it's a clear expression of God's aseity. And so what does it mean for God to have life in himself? It means all resources of life, all resources of being are in himself. Think of Psalm 50, verse 12. It's a very poetic, understated way, and I hope people don't interpret it this way. When he says, if I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine. You're not supposed to take from that verse, well, I wonder if he really is hungry. No, it's a poetic, understated way to say, no, don't even go there. Okay, he's just using sarcasm to say it. Everything is God's. There's nothing that, just that you couldn't contribute to him, but that anything could contribute to him. When God gives, he doesn't deplete himself. He gives all sorts of things to us. When he gives it to us, is he emptying his bank account even a little bit? No. When things are gifted to us, God still owns it entirely when we possess it. There's no addition of resources because there's no addition of being. And so really that's the sense of Romans 11:36, and going back to verse 33, actually, that whole section of Romans 11. Any addition of resource would be an addition of capacities to God, an addition of power to God, and he wouldn't be independent. He wouldn't be self-sufficient. What about God's knowledge? I know we're not on omniscience yet, but God's knowledge is grounded in himself. Isaiah 40, verse 14, he says, whom did he consult? And who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice? and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding. Okay, see, so even though we're not on omniscience right now, one of the things you're going to see right away is that all the other attributes, because of simplicity, when we talk about any attribute, we're really going to be talking about some other ones. We shouldn't be surprised because of the doctrine of simplicity. So here in his knowledge is ase. His knowledge is of himself. You contribute nothing to his knowledge, nor could anything. But couldn't God contribute to his own learning? No, because then that thing that he looks at the bottom of the ocean that no marine biologists may have ever discovered, or the farthest reaches of the universe, or infinity on the number line that no mathematician in principle could ever look at, if God freely chose to learn, then God would not be ase. Something would be causing him, and you're right back to composite and some of the other attributes we'll look at next week and beyond. As Dalazal said it, every time a Puritan says of himself, he is expressing aseity. So we heard that from Charnock earlier, of himself. So where do the Puritans talk about this? Do they write a book about it? Yeah, every book. So every time a Puritan says of himself, that's what they mean. They mean divine aseity. His love is of himself. His covenantal promises are of himself. His faithfulness to the promises are of himself. A.W. Pink says, quote, God gives to all and is enriched by none. God gives to all and is enriched by none. So these are just a couple of simple ways to see how aseity plays out just in the language of Scripture and other attributes. Let's look at some implications. Notice first of all the implications running both ways. From simplicity to aseity and aseity back to simplicity. So, and these are both in the foundation of our house of theology. So let's take big picture view. The house is going to go up that way, but we're not going to touch that because we're doing the doctrine of God. But in this doctrine of God, we're going to see that this is going to imply this, and this is going to imply that. Now, in logic, we call that a logically equivalent relationship. They actually imply each other. Which, if you hear, in A.W. Pink, for example, not only are you getting saturated in Scripture, but Pink is saying an awful lot, things like, now if God is immutable, it is unthinkable that he should ever learn anything. What's he doing there? He's doing logic with the divine attributes. He's not just leaving them as things on a shelf, but he's saying, if this is true, this must be true. You can't take one out that you just don't like, because the rest of it, it's disintegrated. Okay, at least in your thinking. So notice the implications running both ways. Let's just give you one example for each way. First of all, from the premise of simplicity. So let's start here. This is our number one. From the premise of simplicity, we conclude aseity because, and here's the argument, since God is all that he has, all that is in God is God. These are not properties and stuff that he simply possesses from outside of himself. Since God is all that he has, therefore, God has all of his attributes of himself. So one really means, it's a short cheating way to say it is one really means the other from a different angle. That's one way to say it. Second, you can go the other way. From the premise of aseity, we conclude simplicity because since the first cause must be independent, or ase, the first cause must be independent, therefore there can be no whole in God depending on any part. In other words, these stand in a logically equivalent relationship. To say all of this one more way, aseity cannot be false for the same reason that self-creation cannot be true. I sent something out on Facebook the other day. It was R.C. Sproul on the aseity of God. And if you watch the video, you're 15 minutes in and you're like, okay, when's he going to get to aseity? This is cool stuff about self-creation, but I love that stuff, apologetics, the whole 9 yards. But when's he going to talk about aseity? And you're like, actually, he's talking about aseity. Because if this being, again, don't picture think here, it's just representing logically God, what's the problem with self-creation? So now pretend this circle is the cosmos, the universe. Self-creation is saying, right there, self-creation is saying, self-creation, it created itself, it has to be there, but it's not created yet, and not be there at the same time and in the same relationship. And that violates the most fundamental law of thought, the law of non-contradiction. But if self-creation is a violation of the law of non-contradiction, then for the same reason, the opposite of aseity would be a violation of the law of non-contradiction, because God would be there activating himself before he's there. He's there, he's acting upon himself and not acting at the same time and in the same relationship. And so the same fundamental problem with self-creation is at work if we try to think about God in a way that is not of himself. Okay, first cause cannot be its own cause. That's why we have to watch our language and not say that he causes himself. No, he doesn't cause himself. He's uncaused. Okay, divine aseity implies that there can be no cause for which anything in God is an effect. This is important for love. This is important for prayer. This is important for faithfulness to the covenant. This is important for reward of works, or what is he rewarding, and so forth. This is true about first cause, the efficient cause, and it's true about the last cause or final cause or end cause. And notice these are outside of God, which is not going to work, is it? Okay? And so it's true not only about what is the first cause of things, but what is the end or the goal, the end cause of things. Okay? And so Paul says in Romans 11:36 that from him and through him and to him are all things. And one of the things that means is that you can't think of anything that violates his aseity, both in the first cause and in the final cause. Implications for everything. God is the first cause of everything, even things now. And those things were made for some end in himself. There is no thing outside himself on the basis of which he does everything he does. So think of Aquinas' logic and put that together with Jonathan Edwards' logic in the end for which God created the world. These are not two different worldviews going on here. This is crucially important to the rest of our theology. Okay, and as a corollary to this, this doctrine also implies that there is no deficiency in God that explains the acts of creation or redemption or restoration. And so when we talk about a simple level, why did God create? Well, he wanted to experience love. And perhaps the person that says that wouldn't say because he was lonely, because he was bored, maybe they wouldn't say that, but they'll say that and not realize that kind of is what they're saying. But on a more sophisticated level, let's talk about best possible worlds and Leibniz, and God had to create the best possible world. What do you mean by best, and so forth? And a world outside of God is what is best. Okay, so maybe that's a little needle at what's wrong with that. So on a simple level or a sophisticated level, we have to understand that no deficiency in God is, and therefore there cannot be a perfection of God that something here is coming in to move him or motivate him. 5 examples, 5 attributes of God that will all be of himself and ase. First is love. We maintain that God's love is ase, so that he did not need to create in order to have his love fulfilled. 1 John 4:8, God is love. Jeremiah 31:3, I've loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I continue my faithfulness to you. The reason, of course, Deuteronomy 7, I love you because I love you. But really what's happening there is the whole basis of love that is love down here is the love which needs nothing to love. God's wisdom. Secondly, God's wisdom is ase, so that he did not exercise wisdom in such a way that ever caught up to the flow of human action or the flow of natural consequences. In other words, we don't say that God is wise because of how he reacted, since his counsel and his decree can be no such thing. They can't be a reaction in that sense. And what's going to seem paradoxical to some people, the third one, God's freedom is of himself. God's freedom is ase, which is going to create the most complex 2 realities. 2 things happening in reality. Don't take that way. God's freedom is of himself. And that means this. His choices are always unbound by anything outside of himself, and yet always determined by his whole simple nature. That's how we resist voluntarism on the one hand. God's justice is, and we'll come back to that. We'll do a lot on that. God's will. We'll talk about that. God's justice, fourthly, is ase, so that The Euthyphro dilemma, you ever hear that? And of course, that only really works on the pagan gods anyway, because they had that problem. But is what is right because God says so, or is it really right, independent of Him? And it's like whoosh, whoosh. Neither, no, wrong, bad, false dilemma, no. But why is it a false dilemma? Well, it's because God's justice is of Himself. Both what is right because God says so, and whatever He commands really is right by the most objective standard, not some blueprint of justice outside of Himself, but His own whole just being. Last example, fifthly, God's eternity. God's eternity is ase, or of Himself. He is not in this thing called eternity, as if the essence of eternity were an endless duration of events or experiences. Rather, it is, first of all, a quality of the divine life in itself. And we'll look at that. That's that famous definition of Boethius of divine eternality, which is not simply a whole lot of time. And if you just stack it up, that is a manifestation of eternity, but that's not the essence of it. Returning to the scriptures, divine aseity has to shape the way we understand passages that seem to suggest God responding to the creature as if the creature was an initiating force. Just two examples. James 4:8. Draw near to God and He will draw near to you. What's that mean? It means what it says. That's what I say. I say it means what it says. What does it say? Oh, well, it must be saying that we do this first. And what are you doing with your arms? I don't see that in the text. I love it when people say, just give me the Bible. And then they proceed to, do all these things and use words that are not in there. And draw near to me and I will draw near to you. He doesn't tell you which happened first. He's not giving you a metaphysic. He's giving you a summons to pray and to pursue God. So do that and stop pretending that you know more about metaphysics than you do. Draw near to God and He will draw near to you. Here's another one. 2 Chronicles, I'll really answer it in a second. But 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, much like the Ninevites, remember, Jonah 3:10, then I will hear from heaven. Clue 1, doesn't have an ear. Just one clue right there. And I will... So I hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin and heal their land. So the idea that God is, and I'll show you verses that say God relented. And the King James says He repented. And that's Exodus 32. But so it's a little bit, ratcheted up from Jonah 3:10. We'll get to that when we talk about immutability. We'll really get into those passages. But at least here you can see it looks like the human actor is an initiating actor. They are activating God, and God's responding. God's responding and replying to the action that acts upon Him. Already getting into impassibility, but we just have to go there. Both the human actor drawing near and the human repentance are acts that are decreed and empowered by God. I think James 1:17, same book of James, by the way, that says, draw near to me and I'll draw near to you, also says, James 1:17, that there is no, that's the change part of it, but come on, brain. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. But the first part, we'll talk about the second part in a couple weeks, but the first part is saying every good and perfect gift, except for your drawing near, you're on your own for that one. And congratulations, by the way. No, every good and perfect gift is from above. And so, yes, add extra. He is drawing near to us. He is giving us blessing. So two wrong ways to think about it. One is sort of the open theist and way out there thing that says, okay, God is responding. You go first, He goes second. But then there's also the theistic personalists that are Calvinists that say, no, God's the initiating actor, and so God's really the number one. You're 1A, and because He chooses to be moved, and that gets into impassibility. But that's wrong too. Okay? God has ordained, so you're assuming for God to ordain, it's got to be like chess. And He just has a much bigger view than you have. Now I'm getting into omniscience. My point is that both the condition that is prescribed to us, do this, pray, and the and the action when we do it are decreed and empowered, both decreed, one empowered by God. And so, how these are reconciled exactly is something we're going to return to again and again when we talk about some of those other related attributes. But for now, we only insist that God's designs in prayer and all other personal relationship to God flow out of Him and never activate any potential in Him. The cause and effects, the conditions and the consequences are set forth in the prescription: do this and live, don't do it and die. And both are they're supplied, either the power to obey or by permission to disobey. Each is ordained by God. Now, this will make more sense as you pile on more attributes, as his omniscience sees every point, but he doesn't see it as points. It's like not a problem anyway once you start to look at all those other attributes. Because in fact, from this to that, there's no secession going on in his experience anyway. And so he's decreed all and therefore knows all. I love the way Phaser says it. It makes a lot of sense for God to know everything that's going to happen, because the strongest way to know something that's going to happen is if you cause it to happen. And so the storyteller knows everything that's going to happen in a stronger sense than anyone else knows what's going to happen in that story. And so that's why Phaser should be a Calvinist, because you pretty much just filled in the whole coloring book right there. You're pretty much a Reformed Thomist. You may not know that yet. So moving on, objections. Oh, so what kind of objections would there be to this? And that's the whole thing. Typically, professing Christians are not going to object to divine aseity. They're not going to say, oh, God's not independent and so on. Usually they'll just use other words because of the whole old-fashioned Latin thing going on here. But as I said, when there's attacks against this doctrine, it's not going to be the same kind of things. Oh, well, yeah, that's old and that's static. They're not going to say that about this, but what they're going to do is they're going to undermine, because of this relationship and others, there's other doctrines that are related to aseity, such that if you knock them out, you'll undermine aseity like kicking out, the kickstand to a bike. I don't know why I went there. But so theistic personalism will do that by saying God can sovereignly choose to be moved outside of himself. We'll see that clearly next week when you talk about, I think next week we're doing immutability and impassibility, and you'll see more and more of what's at stake. But I'll leave it at that, open it to Q&A and all that good stuff.